Attributes of selfishness ***. What is implied in disobedience to moral law? In discussing this question, I remind you of what constitutes disobedience to moral law. I show what is implied in it. What constitutes disobedience to moral law? 1. We have seen that disobedience to moral law consists always in selfishness. 2. Selfishness consists in the ultimate choice of our own gratification. 3. An ultimate choice is the choice of an end, or the choice of something for its own sake, or for its own intrinsic value. For the choice of our own gratification as an ultimate end is the preference of our own gratification, not merely because gratification is a good, but because, and upon condition, that it is our own gratification, or a good to self. 5. Selfishness chooses and cares for good only upon condition that it belongs to self. It is not the gratification of being in general, but self-gratification upon which selfishness terminates. It is a good because it belongs to self, or is chosen upon that condition. But when it is affirmed that selfishness is sin, and the whole of sin, we are in danger of misconceiving the vast import of the word, and of taking a very narrow and superficial and inadequate view of the subject. It is therefore indispensable to raise and push the inquiry: what is implied in selfishness? What are its characteristics and essential elements? What modifications or attributes does it develop and manifest under the various circumstances in which in the providence of God it is placed? It consists in the committal of the will to the gratification of desire. The Apostle calls it fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind. What must be implied in the state of mind, which consists in the committal of the whole being to the gratification of self as an end? What must be the effect upon the desires themselves to be thus indulged? What must be the effect upon the intellect to have its high demands trampled underfoot? What must be the developments of it in the outward life? What must be the effect upon the temper and spirit to have self-indulgence the law of the soul? This leads to the investigation of the point before us, namely, what is implied in disobedience to moral law? The inquiry, it will be seen, naturally divides itself into two branches. The first respects the moral character of selfishness, the second respects the attributes of selfishness. We will attend to these two inquiries in their order, and 1. What is implied in the fact that selfishness is a breach of moral law? Why is selfishness blameworthy? Why is not a spirit of self-seeking in mere animals or brute beasts as much a breach of moral law as is the same spirit in man? If this spirit of self-seeking in man is sin, what is implied in this fact? In other words, what conditions are necessary to render spirit of self-seeking a breach of moral law? These conditions, whatever they are, must be implied in disobedience to moral law. This brings us to the direct consideration of the things that belong to the first branch of our inquiry. 1. Disobedience to moral law implies the possession of the powers of moral agency. These have been so often enumerated as to render any enlargement upon this point unnecessary, except to say that it is impossible for any but a moral agent to violate moral law. Mere animals may do that which the moral law prohibits in moral agents, but the moral law does not legislate over them. Therefore those things in them are not sin, not a violation of moral law. 2. It implies knowledge of the end which a moral agent is bound to choose. We have seen that the moral law requires love, and that this love is benevolence, and that benevolence is the disinterested and impartial choice of the highest good of God, and of being in general as an end. Now it follows that this end must be apprehended before we can possibly choose it. Therefore obligation to choose, it implies the perception or knowledge of it. Disobedience to moral law, then, implies the development in the reason of the idea of the good or valuable to being. A being, therefore, who has not reason, or the ideas of whose reason on moral subjects are not at all developed, cannot violate the law of God, for over such the moral law does not extend its claims. 3. It implies the development of the correlatives of the ideas of the good or the valuable, to wit, the ideas of moral obligation to will or choose it for the sake of its intrinsic value, and also the ideas of right and wrong. When the idea of the valuable to being is once developed, the mind is so constituted that it cannot but instantly or simultaneously affirm its obligation to will it as an end, and every good according to its perceived relative value. 4. Disobedience, etc., also implies the development of the correlative of the ideas of right and wrong, namely, the ideas of praise or blameworthiness, or of merit and demerit. This idea, that is, the idea of moral character, is the correlative of that of right and wrong in such a sense that the idea of right and wrong necessitates and implies the idea of moral character, or of praise and blameworthiness. When these conditions are fulfilled, and not till then, does the spirit of self-seeking, or the choice of our own gratification as an end, become sin or constitute a breach of moral law. It will follow that no beings are subjects of moral government and capable of disobedience to moral law, but such as are moral agents, that is, such as possess both the powers of moral agency, and have these powers in such a state of development and integrity as to render obedience possible. It will follow that neither the brute animals nor idiots, nor lunatics, nor somnambulists, nor indeed any being who is not rational and free, can disobey the moral law. 2. We come now to the second branch of the inquiry, namely, what is implied in selfishness, what are its attributes, and what states of the sensibility and what outward developments are implied in selfishness. This, it will be seen, brings us to the immensely interesting and important task of contrasting selfishness with benevolence. Formerly we considered the attributes of benevolence, and also what states of the sensibility and of the intellect, and also what outward actions were implied in it, as necessarily resulting from it. We are now to take the same course with selfishness, and 1. Voluntariness is an attribute of selfishness. Selfishness has often been confounded with mere desire, but these things are by no means identical. Desire is constitutional, it is a phenomenon of the sensibility, it is a purely involuntary state of mind, and can in itself produce no action, nor can it in itself have moral character. Selfishness is a phenomenon of the will, and consists in committing the will to the gratification of the desires. The desire itself is not selfishness, but submitting the will to be governed by the desires is selfishness. It should be understood that no kind of mere desire, and no strength of mere desire, constitutes selfishness. Selfishness commences when the will yields to the desire and seeks to obey it in opposition to the law of the intelligence. It matters not what kind of desire it is. If it is the desire that governs the will, this is selfishness. It must be the will in a state of committal to the gratification of the desire. 2. Liberty is another attribute of selfishness. That is, the choice of self-gratification is not necessitated by desire, but the will is always free to choose in opposition to desire. This every moral agent is as conscious of as of his own existence. The desire is not free, but the choice to gratify it is and must be free. There is a sense, as I shall have occasion to show, in which slavery is an attribute of selfishness, but not in the sense that the will chooses by a law of necessity to gratify desire. Liberty, in the sense of ability to make an opposite choice, must ever remain an attribute of selfishness, while selfishness continues to be a sin, or while it continues to sustain any relation to moral law. 3. Intelligence is another attribute of selfishness. By this it is not intended that intelligence is an attribute or phenomenon of will, nor that the choice of self-gratification is in accordance with the demands of the intellect, but it is intended that the choice is made with the knowledge of the moral character that will be involved in it. The mind knows its obligation to make an opposite choice. It is not a mistake. It is not a choice made in ignorance of moral obligation to choose the highest good of being as an end in opposition to self-gratification. It is an intelligent choice in the sense that it is a known resistance of the demands of the intellect. It is a known rejection of its claims. It is a known setting up of self-gratification and preferring it to all higher interests. 4. Unreasonableness is another attribute of selfishness. By this it is intended that the selfish choice is in direct opposition to the demands of the reason. The reason was given to rule, that is, to affirm obligation and thus announce the law of God. It affirms law and moral obligation. Obedience to moral law as it is revealed in the reason is virtue. Obedience to the sensibility in opposition to the reason is sin. Selfishness consists in this. It is a dethroning of reason from the seat of government, and an enthroning of blind desire in opposition to it. Selfishness is always and necessarily unreasonable. It is a denial of that divine attribute that allies man to God, makes him capable of virtue, and is a sinking him to the level of a brute. It is a denial of his manhood, of his rational nature. It is a contempt of the voice of God within him, and a deliberate trampling down the sovereignty of his own intellect. Shame on selfishness. It dethrones human reason, and would dethrone the divine and place mere blind lust upon the throne of the universe. The very definition of selfishness implies that unreasonableness is one of its attributes. Selfishness consists in the will's yielding itself to the impulses of the sensibility, in opposition to the demands of the intelligence. Therefore every act or choice of the will is necessarily altogether unreasonable. The sinner, while he continues such, never says nor does one thing that is in accordance with right reason. Hence the Bible says that madness is in their heart while they live. They have made an unreasonable choice of an end, and all their choices of means to secure their end are only a carrying out of their ultimate choice. They are, every one of them, put forth to secure an end contrary to reason. Therefore no sinner who has never been converted has, even in a single instance, chosen otherwise than in direct opposition to reason. They are not merely sometimes unreasonable, but uniformly, and, while they remain selfish, necessarily so. The very first time that a sinner acts or wills reasonably is when he turns to God or repents and becomes a Christian. This is the first instance in which he practically acknowledges that he has reason. All previous to this, every one of the actions of his will and of his life is a practical denial of his manhood, of his rational nature, of his obligation to God or his neighbor. We sometimes hear impenitent sinners spoken of as being unreasonable in such a manner as to imply that all sinners are not so. But this only favors the delusion of sinners, by leaving them to suppose that they are not all of them at all times altogether unreasonable. But the fact is that there is not and there never can be in earth or hell one impenitent sinner, who in any instance acts otherwise than in direct and palpable opposition to his reason. It had therefore been infinitely better for sinners if they had never been endowed with reason. They do not merely act without consulting their reason, but in stout and determined opposition to it. Again, they act as directly in opposition to it as they possibly can. They not only oppose it, but they oppose it as much in as aggravated a manner as possible. What can be more directly and aggravatedly opposed to reason than the choice which the sinner makes of an end? Reason was given him to direct him in regard to the choice of the great end of life. It gives him the idea of the eternal and the infinite. It spreads out before him the interests of God and of the universe as of absolutely infinite value. It affirms their value and the infinite obligation of the sinner to consecrate himself to these interests, and it promises him endless rewards if he will do so. On the contrary, it lays before him the consequences of refusal. It thunders in his ear the terrible sanctions of the law. It points him to the coming doom that awaits his refusal to comply with its demands. But behold, in the face of all this, the sinner unhesitatingly in the face of these affirmations, demands and threatenings turns away, and consecrates himself to the gratification of his desires, with the certainty that he could not do greater despite to his own nature than in this most mad, most preposterous, most blasphemous choice. Why do not sinners consider that it is impossible for them to offer a greater insult to God, who gave them reason, or more truly and deeply to shame, and degrade themselves than they do in their beastly selfishness? Total, universal, and shameless unreasonableness is the universal characteristic of every selfish mind. 5. Interestedness is another attribute of selfishness. By interestedness is meant self-interestedness. It is not the disinterested choice of good, that is, it is not the choice of the good of being in general as an end, but it is the choice of self-good, of good to self. Its relation to self is the condition of the choice of this good, but for its being the good of self it would not be chosen. The fundamental reason, or that which should induce choice, to wit the intrinsic value of good, is rejected as insufficient, and the secondary reason, namely its relation to self, is the condition of determining the will in this direction. This is really making self-good the supreme end. In other words, it is making self-gratification the end. Nothing is practically regarded as worthy of choice, except as it sustains to self the relation of a means of self-gratification. This attribute of selfishness secures a corresponding state of the sensibility. The sensibility under this indulgence attains to a monstrous development either generally or in some particular directions. Selfishness is the committal of the will to the indulgence of the propensities, but from this it by no means follows that all of the propensities will be indiscriminately indulged and thereby greatly developed. Sometimes one propensity and sometimes another has the greatest natural strength and thereby gains the ascendancy in the control of the will. Sometimes circumstances tend more strongly to the development of one appetite or passion than another. Whatever propensity is most indulged will gain the greatest development. The propensities cannot all be indulged at once, for they are often opposed to each other, but they may all be indulged and developed in their turn. For example, the licentious propensities and various other propensities cannot be indulged consistently with the simultaneous indulgence of the avaricious propensities, the desire of reputation, and of ultimate happiness. Each of these and even all the propensities may come in for a share, and in some instances may gain so equal a share of indulgence as upon the whole to be about equally developed. But in general, either from constitutional temperament or from circumstances, some one or more of the propensities will gain so uniform a control of the will as to occasion its monstrous development. It may be the love of reputation, and then there will be at least a public decent exterior, more or less strict according to the state of morals in the society in which the individual dwells. If it be amativeness that gains the ascendancy over the other propensities, licentiousness will be the result. If it be alimentiveness, then gluttony and epicureanism will be the result. The result of selfishness must be to develop in general, or in particular, the propensities of the sensibility, and to beget a corresponding exterior. If avarice take the control of the will, we have the haggard and ragged miser. All the other propensities wither under the reign of this detestable one. Where the love of knowledge prevails, we have the scholar, the philosopher, the man of learning. This is one of the most decent and respectable forms of selfishness, but is nevertheless as absolutely selfishness as any other form. When compassion as a feeling prevails, we have as a result the philanthropist and often the reformer. not the reformer in a virtuous sense but the selfish reformer. Where love of kindred prevails, we often have the kind husband, the affectionate father, mother, brother, sister, and so on. These are the amiable sinners, especially among their own kindred. When the love of country prevails, we have the patriot, the statesman, and the soldier. This picture might be drawn at full length, but with these traits, I must leave you to fill up the outline. I would only add that several of these forms of selfishness so nearly resemble certain forms of virtue, as often to be confounded with them and mistaken for them. Indeed, so far as the outward life is concerned, they are right in the letter, but as they do not proceed from disinterestedly benevolent intention, they are only specious forms of selfishness. 6. Partiality is another attribute of selfishness. It consists in giving the preference to certain interests on account of their being either directly the interests of self or so connected with self-interest as to be preferred on that account. It matters not whether the interest to which the preference is given be of greater or of less value, if so be it is preferred not for the reason of its greater value, but because of its relation to self. In some instances, the practical preference may justly be given to a less interest, on account of its sustaining such a relation to us, that we can secure it when the greater interest could not be secured by us. If the reason of the preference in such case be not that it is self-interest, but an interest that can be secured, while the greater cannot, the preference is a just one and not partiality. My family, for example, sustain such relations to me that I can more readily and surely secure their interests than I can those of my neighbor or of a stranger. For this reason, I am under obligation to give the practical preference to the interests of my own family, not because they are my own nor because their interests sustain such a relation to my own, but because I can more readily secure their interests than those of any other family. The question in such a case turns upon the amount I am able to secure, and not on their intrinsic value merely. It is a general truth that we can secure more readily and certainly the interests of those to whom we sustain certain relations, and therefore God and reason point out these interests as particular objects of our attention and effort. This is not partiality but impartiality. It is treating interests as they should be treated. But selfishness is always partial. If it gives any interest whatever the preference it is, because of its relation to self, it always and continuing to be selfishness necessarily lays the greatest stress upon and gives the preference to those interests the promotion of which will gratify self. Here care should be taken to avoid delusion. Oftentimes selfishness appears to be very disinterested and very impartial. For example, here is a man whose compassion as a mere feeling or state of the sensibility is greatly developed. He meets a beggar an object that strongly excites his ruling passion. He empties his pockets and even takes off his coat and gives it to him, and in his paroxysm he will divide his all with him or even give him all. Now this would generally pass for most undoubted virtue as a rare and impressive instance of moral goodness, but there is no virtue, no benevolence in it. It is the mere yielding of the will to the control of feeling, and has nothing in it of the nature of virtue. Innumerable examples of this might be adduced as illustrations of this truth. It is only an instance and an illustration of selfishness. It is the will seeking to gratify the feeling of compassion, which for the time is the strongest desire. We constitutionally desire not only our own happiness, but also that of men in general when their happiness in no way conflicts with our own. Hence, selfish men will often manifest a deep interest in the welfare of those whose welfare will not interfere with their own. Now, should the will be yielded up to the gratification of this desire, this would often be regarded as virtue. For example, a few years since much interest and feeling were excited in this country by the cause and sufferings of the Greeks in their struggle for liberty, and since in the cause of the Poles. A spirit of enthusiasm appeared, and many were ready to give and do almost anything for the cause of liberty. They gave up their will to the gratification of this excited state of feeling. This they may have supposed was virtue, but it was not, nor was there a semblance of virtue about it, when it is once understood that virtue consists in yielding the will to the law of the intelligence, and not to the impulse of excited feelings. Some writers have fallen into the strange mistake of making virtue to consist in seeking the gratification of certain desires, because as they say these desires are virtuous. They make some of the desires selfish and some benevolent. To yield the will to the control of the selfish propensities is sin. To yield the will to the control of the benevolent desires, such as the desire of my neighbor's happiness, and of the public happiness, is virtue, because these are good desires while the selfish desires are evil. Is not this the doctrine taught by Bishop Butler? Now this is and has been a very common view of virtue and vice, but it is fundamentally erroneous. None of the constitutional desires are good or evil in themselves. They are all alike involuntary, and all alike terminate on their correlated objects. To yield the will to the control of any one of them, no matter which, is sin. It is following a blind feeling, desire, or impulse of the sensibility, instead of yielding to the demands of the intelligence as the law-affirming power. to will the good of my neighbor or of my country and of God, because of the intrinsic value of those interests, that is, to will them as an end, and in obedience to the law of the reason, is virtue. But to will them to gratify a constitutional but blind desire is selfishness and sin. The desires terminate on their respective objects, but the will in this case seeks the objects not for their own sake, but because they are desired, that is, to gratify the desires. This is choosing them not as an end, but as a means of self-gratification. This is making self-gratification the end after all. This must be a universal truth when a thing is chosen merely in obedience to desire. Partiality consists in giving one thing the preference over another for no good reason. That is not because the intelligence demands this preference, but because the sensibility demands it. Partiality is therefore always and necessarily an attribute of selfishness. 7. Impenitence is another modification of selfishness. Perhaps it is more proper to say that impenitence is only another name for selfishness. Penitence or repentance is the turning of the heart from selfishness to benevolence. Impenitence is the heart's cleaving to the commission of sin under light or under the pressure of affirmed obligation, or more properly cleaving to that the willing and doing of which is sin, but this we shall more fully see in another place. 8. Unbelief is another modification or attribute of selfishness. Unbelief is not a mere negation or the mere absence of faith. Faith as an attribute of benevolence is that quality which commits it to truth, and to the God of truth to veracity, as a condition of securing its end. Unbelief as an attribute of selfishness is that quality that withholds confidence and refuses to trust in God or to commit itself to truth. Faith as an attribute of benevolence is the quality in the nature of benevolence that causes it to commit itself to truth in specific executive acts. This attribute of benevolence causes it to commit the life and the whole being to be molded and influenced by truth. Unbelief as an attribute of selfishness is that quality that causes it to withhold specific acts of confidence in God and in truth. It is saying, I will take care of my own interests and let God take care of his. Who is God that I should serve him, and what profit should I have if I pray unto him? It is that in selfishness which is the ground of the refusal to commit ourselves to the guidance of God, and which leads us to trust in our own guidance. It is self-trust, self-dependence. And what is this but selfishness and our own self-seeking? Christ says to the Jews, How can ye believe which seek honor one of another, and seek not the honor that cometh from God only? This assumes that unbelief is a modification of selfishness, that their regard to their reputation with men rendered faith, while that self-seeking spirit was indulged, impossible. They withheld confidence in Christ because it would cost them their reputation with men to believe. So every sinner who ever heard the gospel and has not embraced it withholds confidence from Christ because it will cost self too much to yield this confidence. This is true in every case of unbelief. Confidence is withheld because to yield it involves and implies the denying of ourselves all ungodliness and every worldly lust. Christ requires the abandonment of every form and degree of selfishness. To believe is to receive with the heart Christ's instruction and requirements, to trust in them, to commit our whole being to be molded by them. Unbelief, then, is only a selfish withholding of this confidence, this committal. The fact is that faith implies and consists in the renunciation of selfishness, and unbelief is only selfishness contemplated in its relation to Christ and his gospel. This lecture was given to us by Dennis Carroll. Lecture XXVIII. Attributes of Selfishness *. What is implied in disobedience to the law of God? 9. Efficiency is another attribute of selfishness. Desire never produces action until it influences the will. It has no efficiency or causality in itself. It cannot, without the concurrence of the will, command the attention of the intellect or move a muscle of the body. The whole causality of the mind resides in the will. In it resides the power of accomplishment. Again, the whole efficiency of the mind as it respects accomplishment resides in the choice of an end or in the ultimate intention. All action of the will or all willing must consist in choosing either an end or the means of accomplishing an end. If there is choice, something is chosen. That something is chosen for some reason. To deny this is a denial that anything is chosen. The ultimate reason for the choice and the thing chosen are identical. This we have repeatedly seen. Again, we have seen that the means cannot be chosen until the end is chosen. The choice of the end is distinct from the volitions or endeavors of the mind to secure the end. But although the choice of an end is not identical with the subordinate choices and volitions to secure the end, yet it necessitates them. The choice once made secures or necessitates the executive volitions to secure the end. By this it is not intended that the mind is not free to relinquish its end, and of course to relinquish the use of the means to accomplish it, but only that while the choice or intention remains the choice of the end, by the will is efficient in producing volitions to realize the end. This is true both of benevolence and selfishness. They are both choices of an end, and are necessarily efficient in producing the use of the means to realize this end. They are choices of opposite ends and, of course, will produce their respective results. The Bible represents sinners as having eyes full of adultery and that cannot cease from sin, that while the will is committed to the indulgence of the propensities, they cannot cease from the indulgence. There is no way, therefore, for the sinner to escape from the commission of sin, but to cease to be selfish. While selfishness continues, you may change the form of outward manifestation, you may deny one appetite or desire for the sake of indulging another, but it is and must be sin still. The desire to escape hell and to obtain heaven may become the strongest, in which case selfishness will take on a most sanctimonious type. But if the will is following desire, it is selfishness still, and all your religious duties, as you call them, are only selfishness robed in the stolen habiliments of loving obedience to God. Be it remembered then that selfishness is and must be efficient in producing its effects. It is cause, the effect must follow. The whole life and activity of sinners is founded in it. It constitutes their life, or rather their spiritual death. They are dead in trespasses and in sins. It is in vain for them to dream of doing anything good until they relinquish their selfishness. While this continues, they cannot act at all except as they use the means to accomplish a selfish end. It is impossible, while the will remains committed to a selfish end, or to the promotion of self-interest or self-gratification, that it should use the means to promote a benevolent end. The first thing is to change the end, and then the sinner can cease from outward sin. Indeed, if the end be changed, many of the same acts which were before sinful will become holy. While the selfish end continues, whatever a sinner does is selfish. Whether he eats or drinks or labors or preaches, or in short whatever he does, is to promote some form of self-interest. The end being wrong, all is and must be wrong. But let the end be changed. Let benevolence take the place of selfishness, and all is right. With this end in view, the mind is absolutely incapable of doing anything, or of choosing anything, except as a means of promoting the good of the universe. I wish to impress this truth deeply upon the mind, and therefore give the substance of the preceding remarks in the form of definite propositions. All action consists in or results from choice. Roman 2, all choice must respect or consist in the choice of an end or of means. The mind is incapable of choosing, unless it has an object of choice, and that object must be regarded by the mind either as an end or as a means. Roman 3, the mind can have but one ultimate end at the same time. Roman 4, it cannot choose the means until it has chosen the end. It cannot choose one end, and use means to accomplish another at the same time. Roman 6, therefore while the will is benevolent or committed to the glory of God, and the good of being, it cannot use the means of self-gratification in a selfish sense, or in other words, it cannot put forth selfish volitions. Roman 7, when the will is committed to self-indulgence, it cannot use the means designed to glorify God and promote the good of men as an end. This is impossible. Roman 8, the carnal heart or mind cannot but sin. It is not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can be, because it is enmity against God. Roman 9, the new or regenerate heart cannot sin. It is benevolence, love to God and man. This cannot sin. These are both ultimate choices or intentions. They are from their own nature efficient, each excluding the other, and each securing for the time being the exclusive use of means to promote its end. To deny this is the same as to maintain either that the will can at the same time choose two opposite ends, or that it can choose one end only, but at the same time choose the means to accomplish another end not yet chosen. Now either alternative is absurd. Then holiness and sin can never coexist in the same mind at the same time. Each, as has been said, for the time being necessarily excludes the other. Selfishness and benevolence coexist in the same mind. A greater absurdity and a more gross contradiction was never conceived or expressed. No one for a moment ever supposed that selfishness and benevolence could coexist in the same mind who had clearly defined ideas of what they are. When desire is mistaken on the one hand for benevolence, and on the other for selfishness, the mistake is natural that selfishness and benevolence can coexist in the same mind. But as soon as it is seen that benevolence and selfishness are supreme ultimate opposite choices, the affirmation is instantaneous and irresistible that they can neither coexist nor can one use means to promote the other. While benevolence remains, the mind's whole activity springs from it as from a fountain. This is the philosophy of Christ. Either make the tree good and his fruit good, or else make the tree corrupt and his fruit corrupt, for the tree is known by his fruit. A good man out of the good treasure of the heart bringeth forth good things, and an evil man out of the evil treasure bringeth forth evil things. Matthew 12:33-35. Doth a fountain send forth at the same place sweet water and bitter? Can the fig tree, my brethren, bear olive berries, either vine figs? So can no fountain both yield salt water and fresh. James 3:11-12. For a good tree bringeth not forth corrupt fruit, neither doth a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. For every tree is known by his own fruit. For of thorns men do not gather figs, nor of a bramble bush gather they grapes. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart bringeth forth that which is good, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart bringeth forth that which is evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaketh. Luke 6:43-45. 10. Opposition to benevolence, or to virtue, or to holiness and true religion, is one of the attributes of selfishness. This quality belongs to the nature of selfishness. Selfishness is not in its relations to benevolence a mere negation. It cannot be. It is the choice of self-gratification as the supreme and ultimate end of life. While the will is committed to this end, and benevolence, or a mind committed to an opposite end, is contemplated, the will cannot remain in a state of indifference to benevolence. It must either yield its preference of self-indulgence, or resist the benevolence which the intellect perceives. The will cannot remain in the exercise of this selfish choice, without as it were bracing and girding itself against that virtue which it does not imitate. If it does not imitate it, it must be because it refuses to do so. The intellect does and must strongly urge the will to imitate benevolence and to seek the same end. The will must yield or resist, and the resistance must be more or less resolute and determined, as the demands of the intellect are more or less emphatic. This resistance to benevolence, or to the demands of the intellect in view of it, is what the Bible calls hardening the heart. It is obstinacy of will under the light, and the presence of true religion, and the admitted claims of benevolence. This opposition to benevolence or true religion must be developed in specific action. Whenever the mind apprehends true religion or selfishness, must be abandoned. Not only must this opposition be developed or selfishness abandoned under such circumstances, but it must increase as true religion displays more and more of its loveliness. As the light from the radiant sun of benevolence is poured more and more upon the darkness of selfishness, the opposition of this principle of action must of necessity manifest itself in the same proportion, or selfishness must be abandoned. Thus selfishness remaining under light must manifest more and more opposition, just in proportion as light increases, and the soul has less the color of an apology for its opposition. This peculiarity of selfishness has always been manifested, just in proportion as it has been brought into the light of true religion. This accounts for all the opposition that has been made to true religion since the world began. It also proves that where there are impenitent sinners, and they retain their impenitence and manifest no hostility to the religion which they witness, that there is something defective in the professed piety which they behold, or at least they do not contemplate all the attributes of a true piety. It also proves that persecution will always exist where much true religion is manifested to those who hold fast their selfishness. It is indeed true that selfishness and benevolence are just as much opposed to each other, and just as much and as necessarily at war with each other as God and Satan, as heaven and hell. There can never be a truce between them. They are essential and eternal opposites. They are not merely opposites, but they are opposite efficient causes. They are essential activities. They are the two and the only two great antagonistic principles in the universe of mind. Each is heaving and energizing like an earthquake to realize its end. A war of mutual and uncompromising extermination necessarily exists between them. Neither can be in the presence of the other without repulsion and opposition. Each puts forth all its energy to subdue and overcome the other, and already selfishness has shed an ocean of the blood of saints, as well as the precious blood of the Prince of Life. There is not a more gross and injurious mistake than to suppose that selfishness ever under any circumstances becomes reconciled to benevolence. The supposition is absurd and contradictory, since for selfishness to become reconciled to benevolence were the same thing as for selfishness to become benevolence. Selfishness may change the mode of attack or of its opposition, but its real opposition it can never change while it retains its own nature and continues to be selfishness. This opposition of the heart to benevolence often begets deep opposition of feeling. The opposition of the will engages the intellect in fabricating excuses and cavils and lies and refuges, and often greatly perverts the thoughts, and excites the most bitter feelings imaginable toward God and toward the saints. Selfishness will strive to justify its opposition, and to shield itself against the reproaches of conscience, and will resort to every possible expedient to cover up its real hostility to holiness. It will pretend that it is not holiness but sin that it opposes. But the fact is it is not sin but holiness to which it stands forever opposed. The opposition of feeling is only developed when the heart is brought into a strong light and makes deep and strong resistance. In such cases, the sensibility sometimes boils over with feelings of bitter opposition to God and Christ and all good. The question is often asked, may not this opposition exist in the sensibility, and those feelings of hostility to God exist when the heart is in a truly benevolent state? To this inquiry I would reply, if it can, it must be produced by infernal or some other influence that misrepresents God and places his character before the mind in a false light. Blasphemous thoughts may be suggested, and as it were injected into the mind. These thoughts may have their natural effect in the sensibility, and feelings of bitterness and hostility may exist without the consent of the will. The will may all the while be endeavoring to repel these suggestions and divert the attention from such thoughts, yet Satan may continue to hurl his fiery darts, and the soul may be racked with torture under the poison of hell, which seems to be taking effect in the sensibility. The mind at such times seems to itself to be filled so far as feeling is concerned with all the bitterness of hell. And so it is, and yet it may be that in all this there is no selfishness. If the will holds fast its integrity, if it holds out in the struggle, and where God is maligned and misrepresented by the infernal suggestions, it says with Job, "Although he slay me, yet will I trust in him." However sharp the conflict in such cases, we can look back and say, we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. In such cases, it is the selfishness of Satan, and not our own selfishness, that kindled up those fires of hell in our sensibility. Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life. 11. Cruelty is another attribute of selfishness. This term is often used to designate a state of the sensibility. It then represents that state of feeling which has a barbarous or savage pleasure in the misery of others. Cruelty as a phenomenon of the will, or as an attribute of selfishness, consists first in a reckless disregard of the well-being of God and the universe, and secondly in persevering in a course that must ruin the souls of the subjects of it, and so far as they have influence, ruin the souls of others. What should we think of a man who was so intent on securing some petty gratification that he would not give the alarm if a city were on fire, and the sleeping citizens in imminent danger of perishing in the flames? Suppose that sooner than deny himself some momentary gratification, he would jeopard many lives. Should we not call this cruelty? Now there are many forms of cruelty. Because sinners are not always brought into circumstances where they exercise certain forms of it, they flatter themselves that they are not cruel. But selfishness is always and necessarily cruel, cruel to the soul and highest interests of the subject of it, cruel to the souls of others in neglecting to care and act for their salvation, cruel to God in abusing him in 10,000 ways, cruel to the whole universe. If we should be shocked at the cruelty of him who should see his neighbor's house on fire, and the family asleep, and neglect to give them warning, because too self-indulgent to rise from his bed, what shall we say of the cruelty of one who shall see his neighbor's soul in peril of eternal death, and yet neglect to give him warning? Sinners are apt to possess very good dispositions as they express it. They suppose they are the reverse of being cruel. They possess tender feelings, are often very compassionate in their feelings toward those who are sick and in distress, and who are in circumstances of any affliction. They are ready to do many things for them. Such persons would be shocked should they be called cruel, and many professors would take their part and consider them abused. Whatever else it would be said is an attribute of their character, surely cruelty is not. Now it is true that there are certain forms of cruelty with which such persons are not chargeable, but this is only because God has so molded their constitution that they are not delighted with the misery of their fellow men. However, there is no virtue in their not being gratified at the sight of suffering, nor in their painstaking to prevent it while they continue selfish. They follow the impulses of their feelings, and if their temperament were such that it would gratify them to inflict misery on others, if this were the strongest tendency of their sensibility, their selfishness would instantly take on that type. But though cruelty in all its forms is not common to all selfish persons, it is still true that some form of cruelty is practiced by every sinner. God says, "The tender mercies of the wicked are cruel." The fact that they live in sin, that they set an example of selfishness, that they do nothing for their own souls nor for the souls of others. These are really most atrocious forms of cruelty, and infinitely exceed all those comparatively petty forms that relate to the miseries of men in this life. 12. Injustice is another attribute of selfishness. Justice as an attribute of benevolence is that quality that disposes it to regard and treat every being and interest with exact equity. Injustice is the opposite of this. It is that quality of selfishness which disposes it to treat the persons and interests of others inequitably, and a disposition to give the preference to self-interest regardless of the relative value of the interests. The nature of selfishness demonstrates that injustice is always and necessarily one of its attributes, and one that is universally and constantly manifested. There is the utmost injustice in the end chosen. It is the practical preference of a petty self-interest over infinite interests. This is injustice as great as possible. This is universal injustice to God and man. It is the most palpable and most flagrant piece of injustice possible to every being in the universe, not one known by him to exist who has not reason to bring against him the charge of most flagrant and shocking injustice. This injustice extends to every act and to every moment of life. He is never in the least degree just to any being in the universe. Nay, he is perfectly unjust. He cares nothing for the rights of others as such, and never even in appearance regards them except for selfish reasons. This then is and can be only the appearance of regarding them, while in fact no right of any being in the universe is, or can be respected by a selfish mind any further than in appearance. To deny this is to deny his selfishness. He performs no act whatever but for one reason, that is to promote his own gratification. This is his end. For the realization of this end, every effort is made, and every individual act and volition put forth. Remaining selfish, it is impossible that he should act at all, but with reference directly or indirectly to this end. But this end has been chosen, and must be pursued if pursued at all in the most palpable and outrageous violation of the rights of God, and of every creature in the universe. Justice demands that he should devote himself to the promotion of the highest good of God and the universe, that he should love God with all his heart and his neighbor as himself. Every sinner is openly, universally, and as perfectly unjust as possible at every moment of his impenitence. It should therefore always be understood that no sinner at any time is at all just to any being in the universe. All his paying of his debts and all his apparent fairness and justice are only a specious form of selfishness. He has, and if a sinner it is impossible that he should not have some selfish reason for all he does, is, says, or omits. His entire activity is selfishness, and while he remains impenitent it is impossible for him to think or act, or will or do or be or say anything more or less than he judges expedient to promote his own interests. He is not just. He cannot be just nor begin in any instance or in the least degree to be truly just either to God or man, until he begins life anew, gives God his heart, and consecrates his entire being to the promotion of the good of universal being. All this justice demands. There is no beginning to be just unless the sinner begins here. Begin and be just in the choice of the great end of life, and then you cannot but be just in the use of means, but be unjust in the choice of an end, and it is impossible for you in any instance to be otherwise than totally unjust in the use of means. In this case, your entire activity is, and can be nothing else than a tissue of the most abominable injustice. The only reason why every sinner does not openly and daily practice every species of outward commercial injustice is that he is so circumstanced that upon the whole he judges it not for his interest to practice this injustice. This is the reason universally, and no thanks to any sinner for abstaining in any instance from any kind or degree of injustice in practice, for he is only restrained and kept from it by selfish considerations. That is, he is too selfish to do it. His selfishness and not the love of God or man prevents. He may be prevented by a constitutional or phrenological conscientiousness or sense of justice, but this is only a feeling of the sensibility, and if restrained only by this, he is just as absolutely selfish as if he had stolen a horse in obedience to acquisitiveness. God so tempers the constitution as to restrain men, that is, that one form of selfishness shall prevail over and curb another. Approbativeness is in most persons so large that a desire to be applauded by their fellow men so modifies the developments of their selfishness that it takes on a type of outward decency and appearance of justice. But this is no less selfishness than if it took on altogether a different type. This lecture was given to us by Dennis Carroll. Lecture Roman 29 *. Attributes of selfishness *. What is implied in disobedience to the law of God? 13. Oppression is another attribute of selfishness. Oppression is the spirit of slaveholding. It is that quality of selfishness that disposes it in practice to deprive others of their rights. It is in the nature of selfishness to do this for the purpose of contributing to our own interest or gratification. To define it comprehensively, it is the disposition inherent in the very nature of selfishness to enslave God and all the universe, to make them all give up their interest and happiness and glory and seek and live for ours. It is a willingness that all beings should live to and for us, that all interests should bend and be sacrificed to ours. It is a practical denial of all rights but our own, and a practical setting up of the claim that all beings are ours, our goods, and chattels our property. It is a spirit that aims at making all beings serve us and all interests subserve our own. This must be an attribute of selfishness. Self-interest is the ultimate end, and such is the nature of the selfish choice of this end, that the whole life and activity and aim and effort is to secure this end, without any disinterested regard to the right or personal liberty of any being in existence. The sinner, while he remains such, has absolutely no other end in view, and no other ultimate motive in anything he does. Selfishness or self-gratification under some form is the reason for every volition, action, and omission. For this end alone he lives and moves and has his being. This being his only end, it is impossible that oppression should not be an attribute of his intention. The whole of oppression is included in the choice of this end of life. Nothing can be more oppressive to the whole universe than for a being to set up his own interest as the sole good and account all other interests as of no value except as they contribute to his own. This is the perfection of oppression, and it matters not what particular course it takes to secure its end. They are all equally oppressive. If he does not seek the good of others for its own sake, but simply as a means of securing his own, it matters not at all so far as his character is concerned whether he pamper and fatten his slaves, or whether he starve them, whether he work them hard or let them lounge, whether he lets them go naked or arrays them in costly attire. All is done for one and but one ultimate reason, and that is to promote self-interest, and not at all for the intrinsic value of any interest but that of self. If such an one prays to God, it is because he is unable to command and govern him by authority, and not at all out of any true regard to the rights or character or relations of God. He desires and solicits God's services just because he cannot get them by force. God's interests and rights are practically treated as of no value by every sinner in the universe. They care nothing for God except to enslave him, that is to make him serve them without any service in return. They have no design to live to and for him, but that he should live to and for them. They regard all other beings just in the same manner. If there is in any instance the semblance of a regard to their interest for its own sake, it is only a semblance and not a reality. It is not and it cannot be a reality. The assertion that it is anything more than hypocritical pretense is absurd, and contradicts the supposition that he is a sinner or selfish. There are innumerable specious forms of oppression that to a superficial observer appear very like a regard to the real interest of the oppressed for its own sake. It may be gratifying to pride, to ambition, or to some other feeling of a slaveholder, to see his slaves, well-fed, well-clad, full-fleshed, cheerful, contented, attached to their master. For the same reason he might feed his dog, provide him a warm kennel, and ornament his neck with a brazen collar. He might show a similar affection to his horse and his swine. But what is the reason of all this? Only to gratify himself. God has so molded his constitution that it would give him pain to whip his slave or his dog or his horse, or to see them hungry or neglected. It would trouble his conscience and endanger his peace and his soul. There may often be the appearance of virtue in a slaveholder and in slaveholding, but it can absolutely be only an appearance. If it be properly slaveholding, it is and must be oppression. It is and must be selfishness. Can it be that slaveholding is designed to promote the good of the slave for its own sake? But this could not be slaveholding. Should an individual be held to service for his own benefit, should the law of benevolence really demand it, this could no more be the crime of slaveholding and oppression than it is murder or any other crime. It would not be selfishness but benevolence, and therefore no crime at all but virtue. But selfishness embodies and includes every element of oppression. Its end, its means, and its every breath form, but an incessant denial of all rights but those of self. All sinners are oppressors and slaveholders in heart and in fact. They practice continual oppression and nothing else. They make God serve them without wages, and as he says, they make him to serve with their sins. God, all men and all things and events are as far as possible made to serve them without the return of the least disinterested regard to their interests. Disinterested regard, why the very terms contradict the supposition that he is a sinner. He can have in no instance any other than selfish aims, in appearing to care for anyone's interest for its own sake. All unconverted abolitionists are slaveholders in heart, and so far as possible in life. There is not one of them who would not enslave every slave at the South and his master too, and all at the North and the whole universe, and God himself so far as he could. Indeed, he does it in spirit, and remaining selfish he cannot, but aim to enslave all beings, make them as far as possible contribute to his interest and pleasure, without the least disinterested regard to their interest in return. Oppression is an essential attribute of selfishness, and always develops itself according to circumstances. When it has power and inclination, it uses the chain and the whip. When it has not power, it resorts to other means of securing the services of others without disinterested return. Sometimes it supplicates, but this is only because it is regarded as necessary or expedient. It is oppression under whatever form it assumes. It is in fact a denial of all rights, but those of self, and a practical claiming of God, and of all beings and events as ours. It is to all intents the chattel principle universally applied, so that all sinners are both slaves and slaveholders. In heart and endeavor they enslave God and all men, and other sinners in heart and endeavor enslave them. Every sinner is endeavoring in heart to appropriate to himself all good. 14. Hostility, open or secret, is another attribute of selfishness. Selfishness is a spirit of strife. It is opposed to peace or amity. Selfishness on the very face of it is a declaration of war with all beings. It is setting up self-interest in opposition to all other interests. It is a deliberate intention prompting to an attempt to seize upon and subordinate all interests to our own. It is impossible that there should not be a state of perpetual hostility between a selfish being and all benevolent beings. They are mutually and necessarily opposed to each other. The benevolent are seeking the universal good, and the selfish are seeking their own gratification, without the least voluntary regard to any interest but that of self. Here is opposition and war of course and of necessity. But it is no less true that every selfish being is at war with every other selfish being. Each is seeking and is fully consecrated to his own interest, and is at the same time denying all rights but his own. Here is and must be strife and hostility. There is no use in talking of putting away slavery or war from earth while selfishness is in it, for they both inhere in the very nature of selfishness, and every selfish being is in spirit and principle an oppressor, a slaveholder, a tyrant, a warrior, a duelist, a pirate, and all that is implied in making war upon all beings. This is no railing accusation, but sober verity. The forms of war and of oppression may be modified indefinitely. The bloody sword may be sheathed. The manacle and the lash may be laid aside, and a more refined mode of oppression and of war may be carried on. But oppression and war must continue under some form so long as selfishness continues. It is impossible that it should not, nor will the more refined and specious, and if you please baptized forms of oppression and war that may succeed those now practiced involve less guilt or be less displeasing to God than the present. No, indeed. As light increases and compels selfishness to lay aside the sword, and bury the manacle and the whip, and profess the religion of Christ, the guilt of selfishness increases every moment. The form of manifestation is changed compelled by increasing light and advancing civilization and Christianization. Oppression and war, although so much changed in form, are not at all abandoned in spirit. Nay, they are only strengthened by increasing light. Nor can it be told with certainty whether the more refined modifications of oppression and war that may succeed will upon the whole be a less evil to mankind. Guilt will certainly increase as light increases. Sin abounds and becomes exceeding sinful, just in proportion as the light of truth is poured upon the selfish mind. Do you ask then, what shall we do? Shall we do nothing but let things go on as they are? I answer no, by no means. Do if possible 10 times more than ever to put away these and all the evils that are under the sun. But aim not only at outward reforms, but also at the annihilation of selfishness. And when you succeed in reforming the heart, the life cannot but be reformed. Put away selfishness, and oppression and war are no more. But engage in bringing about any other reform, and you are but building dams of sand. Selfishness will force for itself a channel, and who can say that its desolations may not be more fearful and calamitous in this new modification than before? Attempting to reform selfishness and teach it better manners is like damming up the waters of the Mississippi. It will only surely overflow its banks and change its channel, and carry devastation and death in its course. I am aware that many will regard this as heresy, but God seeth not as man seeth. Man looketh on the outward appearance, but God looketh on the heart. All the wars and filthiness of heathenism God winks at as comparatively a light thing when put into the scale against the most refined form of intelligent but heartless Christianity that ever existed. But to return, let it be forever understood that selfishness is at war with all nations and with all beings. It has no element of peace in it any further than all beings and all interests are yielded to the gratification of self. This is its essential, its unalterable nature. This attribute cannot cease while selfishness remains. All selfish men who are advocates of peace principles are necessarily hypocrites. They say and do not. They preach but do not practice. Peace is on their lips, but war is in their hearts. They proclaim peace and goodwill to men, while under their stolen robe of peace, they conceal their poisoned implements of war against God and the universe. This must be. I am anxious to make the impression and lodge it deep in your inmost hearts, so that you shall always practically hold and teach, and regard this as a fundamental truth, both of natural and revealed religion, that a selfish man, be he who he may, instead of being a Christian, a man of peace, and a servant of the Prince of Peace, is in heart, in character, in spirit, in fact a rebel, an enemy, a warrior truly, and in fact at war with God and with all beings. 15. Unmercifulness is another attribute of selfishness. Mercy is an attribute of benevolence, and as such has been defined to be that quality that disposes it to pardon crime. It will and must manifest itself in efforts to secure the conditions upon which crime can be reasonably forgiven, if such conditions can be secured. Unmercifulness is that attribute of selfishness that indisposes it to forgive sin, and of course it manifests itself either by resisting efforts to secure its forgiveness, or by treating such efforts with coldness or contempt. The manner in which sinners treat the plan of salvation, the atonement of Christ, the means used by God the Saviour to bring about the pardon of sin, demonstrates that their tender mercies are cruelty. The apostle charges them with being implacable, unmerciful. Their opposition to the gospel, to revivals of religion, and to all the exhibitions of his mercy, which he has made to our world, show that unmercifulness is an attribute of their character. Sinners generally profess to be the friends of mercy. They with their lips extol the mercy of God, but how do they treat it? Do they embrace it? Do they honor it as something which they favor? Do they hold it forth to all men as worthy of all acceptation? Or do they wage an unrelenting war with it? How did they treat Christ when he came on his errand of mercy? They brought forth the appalling demonstration that unmercifulness is an essential attribute of their character. They persecuted unto death the very impersonation and embodiment of mercy. And this same attribute of selfishness has always manifested itself under some form whenever a development and an exhibition of mercy has been made. Let the blood of prophets and apostles, the blood of millions of martyrs, and above all let the blood of the God of mercy speak. What is their united testimony? Why this, that the perfection of unmercifulness is one of the essential and eternal attributes of selfishness. Whenever therefore a selfish being appears to be of a merciful disposition, it can be only in appearance. His feelings may be sensitive, and he may sometimes, nay often or always yield to them, but this is only selfishness. The reason and the only reason why every sinner does not exhibit every appalling form of unmercifulness and cruelty is that God has so tempered his sensibility, and so surrounded him with influences as to modify the manifestation of selfishness, and to develop other attributes more prominently than this. Unmerciful he is, and unmerciful he must be while he remains in sin. To represent him as other than an unmerciful wretch were to misrepresent him, no matter who it is. That delicate female who would faint at the sight of blood, if she is a sinner, she is spurning and scorning the mercy of God. She lets others go down to hell unpardoned without an effort to secure their pardon. Shall she be represented as other than unmerciful? No language can describe the hardness of her heart. See, the cup of salvation is presented to her lips by a Saviour's bleeding hand. She nevertheless dashes it from her, and tramples its contents beneath her feet. It passes from lip to lip, but she offers no prayer that it may be accepted, or if she does it is only the prayer of a hypocrite while she rejects it herself. No, with all her delicacy, her tender mercies are utter cruelty. With her own hands she crucifies the Son of God afresh and would put him to open shame. O monstrous, a woman murdering the Saviour of the world, her hands and garments all stained with blood, and call her merciful. O shame, where is thy blush? 16. Falsehood or lying is another attribute of selfishness. Falsehood may be objective or subjective. Objective falsehood is that which stands opposed to truth. Subjective falsehood is a heart conformed to error and to objective falsehood. Subjective falsehood is a state of mind or an attribute of selfishness. It is the will and the attitude of resisting truth and embracing error and lies. This is always and necessarily an attribute of selfishness. Selfishness consists in the choice of an end opposed to all truth and cannot but proceed to the realization of that end in conformity with error or falsehood instead of truth. If at any time it sees upon objective truth, as it often does, it is with a false intention. It is with an intention at war with the truth, the nature, and the relations of things. If any sinner at any time and under any circumstances tell the truth, it is for a selfish reason. It is to compass a false end. He has a lie in his heart and a lie in his right hand. He stands upon falsehood. He lives for it, and if he does not uniformly and openly falsify the truth, it is because objective truth is consistent with subjective falsehood. His heart is false as it can be. It has embraced and sold itself to the greatest lie in the universe. The selfish man has practically proclaimed that his good is the supreme good, nay, that there is no other good but his own, that there are no other rights but his own, that all are bound to serve him, and that all interests are to yield to his. Now all this, as I said, is the greatest falsehood that ever was or can be, yet this is the solemn practical declaration of every sinner. His choice affirms that God has no rights, that he ought not to be loved, and obeyed, that he has no right to govern the universe, but that God and all beings ought to obey and serve the sinner. Can there be a greater, more shameless falsehood than all this? And shall such an one pretend to regard the truth? Nay, verily. The very pretense is only an instance and an illustration of the truth that falsehood is an essential element of his character. If every sinner on earth does not openly and at all times falsify the truth, it is not because of the truthfulness of his heart, but for some purely selfish reason. This must be, his heart is utterly false. It is impossible that remaining a sinner he should have any true regard to the truth. He is a liar in his heart. This is an essential and an eternal attribute of his character. It is true that his intellect condemns falsehood and justifies truth, and that oftentimes through the intellect a deep impression is or may be made on his sensibility in favor of the truth. But if the heart is unchanged, it holds on to lies and perseveres in the practical proclamation of the greatest lies in the universe, to wit, that God ought not to be trusted, that Christ is not worthy of confidence, that one's own interest is the supreme good, and that all interests ought to be accounted of less value than one's own. 17. Pride is another attribute of selfishness. Pride is a disposition to exalt self above others, to get out of one's proper place in the scale of being and to climb up over the heads of our equals or superiors. Pride is a species of injustice on the one hand and is nearly allied to ambition on the other. It is not a term of so extensive an import as either injustice or ambition. It sustains to each of them a near relation, but is not identical with either. It is a kind of self-praise, self-worship, self-flattery, self-adulation, a spirit of self-consequence, of self-importance. It is a tendency to exalt not merely one's own interest, but one's person above others and above God and above all other beings. A proud being supremely regards himself. He worships and can worship no one but self. He does not, and remaining selfish, he cannot practically admit that there is anyone so good and worthy as himself. He aims at conferring supreme favor upon himself, and practically admits no claim of any being in the universe to any good or interest that will interfere with his own. He can stoop to give preference to the interest, the reputation, the authority of no one, no, not of God himself, except outwardly and in appearance. His inward language is, "Who is Jehovah that I should bow down to him?" It is impossible that a selfish soul should be humble. Sinners are represented in the Bible as proud, as flattering themselves in their own eyes. Pride is not a vice distinct from selfishness, but is only a modification of selfishness. Selfishness is the root or stock in which every form of sin inheres. This it is important to show. Selfishness has been scarcely regarded by many as a vice, much less as constituting the whole of vice. Consequently, when selfishness has been most apparent, it has been supposed and assumed that there might be along with it many forms of virtue. It is for this reason that I make this attempt to show what are the essential elements of selfishness. It has been supposed that selfishness might exist in any heart without implying every form of sin, that a man might be selfish and yet not proud. In short, it has been overlooked that where selfishness is there must be every form of sin, that where there is one form of selfishness manifested it is virtually a breach of every commandment of God, and implies, in fact, the real existence of every possible form of sin and abomination in the heart. My object is fully to develop the great truth that where selfishness is there must be in a state either of development or of undevelopment every form of sin that exists in earth or hell, that all sin is a unit and consists of some form of selfishness, and that where this is all sin virtually is and must be. The only reason that pride as a form of selfishness does not appear in all sinners in the most disgusting forms is only this, that their constitutional temperament and providential circumstances are such as to give a more prominent development to some other attribute of selfishness. It is important to remark that where any one form of unqualified sin exists, there selfishness must exist, and there of course every form of sin must exist at least in embryo, and waiting only for circumstances to develop it. When therefore you see any form of sin, know assuredly that selfishness the root is there, and expect nothing else if selfishness continues than to see developed one after another every form of sin, as the occasion shall present itself. Selfishness is a volcano sometimes smothered, but which must have vent. The providence of God cannot, but present occasions upon which its lava tides will burst forth and carry desolation before them. That all these forms of sin exist has been known and admitted. But it does not appear to me that the philosophy of sin has been duly considered by many. It is important that we should get at the fundamental or generic form of sin, that form which includes and implies all others, or more properly, which constitutes the whole of sin. Such is selfishness. Let it be written with the point of a diamond, and engraved in the rock forever, that it may be known that where selfishness is there every precept of the law is violated, there is the whole of sin. Its guilt and ill desert must depend upon the light with which the selfish mind is surrounded, but sin, the whole of sin, is there. Such is the very nature of selfishness, that it only needs the providential occasions, and to be left without restraint, and it will show itself to have embodied in embryo every form of iniquity.